Hey, how's it going, everybody? This is Devin Haas from Haas Auto West, and today we're going to look at how to take the transfer case in and out of this 1994 ZJ right here. In this case, it's an NP249 transfer case, and it's going to be mated to the 4.6 RH transmission. We're going to look at how to get the vehicle up and on jack stands, and then how to remove the two drive shafts, and how to take the transfer case in and out. So one of our first steps is going to be to jack the vehicle up so that we can get clearance for the transfer case to make it out into the rock rails in this case. You want to lift the vehicle up using a jack and then put it on one of the highest settings on your jack stand. Okay, so I put the jack directly underneath the differential. You want to get it centered on the differential and then lift the vehicle using the jack. In my case, I'm slightly off to one side here because my tire carrier is in my way. Once the vehicle is high enough in the air, you want to place the jack stands directly underneath the axle. And then slowly drop the vehicle down. And sometimes just as you get to the jack stands, it's a good idea to adjust them again and make sure you are centered so that the axle goes right into the middle of the jack stand. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing to the front of the vehicle. Okay, so now I'm at the front of the vehicle, and you can see this time I've actually placed the jack a little bit closer to the center, just off to one side of the differential, because it's a little easier to lift the vehicle straight up. We're going to do the same thing we did in the back. Just pull things up as high as we can. I'm going to go ahead and put the jack in there. And in this case, I'm going just to the one side of the lower control arm. So I've got 8 showing on that side. It's usually a good idea to try and keep things even. So if you have the same number of teeth showing on each side, it's usually a good indication. But once you drop it into place, it will sit evenly. And now the vehicle is up on jack stand. One of the first things we need to do when we're going to remove the transfer case is we need to drain the fluid out of it. So we can see here's the lower plug. There's an upper fill plug right here. In this case, it's going to be a 10mm Allen wrench, but in some cases it might be something you need to get with an adjustable wrench. It just depends on which type of plug it has. So just go ahead and open up the lower fill/drain plug. Make sure you got a cookie sheet and another container ready to catch the fluid. And just try and position your sheet so that it can catch whatever's in there. If you want to make it go a little bit faster, you can go ahead and crack open the top one. Might also make it a little bit smoother. not so much glug, glug, glug. And we're just going to go ahead and let that drain for a minute. Once it's fully drained, I usually put the plugs back in it to make sure I don't lose them or confuse them. Okay, so one of the first things we need to do after we've drained the fluid out is we need to put the transfer case into neutral. So go ahead and put the key in the ignition and give it 2 clicks. And we're going to put our foot on the brake, move the main selector into neutral, and then we're going to move the 4-wheel drive selector into neutral as well, putting the transfer case in neutral. Now, if our wheels are truly off the ground, we should be able to move the drive shafts or move the transfer case input if we need to, and everything should move freely. Hi, baby. So now that we have put the vehicle in neutral and we've put the 2 plugs back into the transfer case, we are here at the rear differential where it connects to the propeller shaft. And we're going to take an 8mm socket wrench and remove each of the 2 strap bolts. We have to hold the drive shaft now that it's in neutral. There are 4 bolts that hold the rear U-joint in place. Now as we take this U-joint apart, it may need a little help to come out. And we have to be careful not to let the end caps come off. On the other end of the propeller shaft is the slip yoke that goes into the transfer case. So it shouldn't come apart, but this U-joint, once it's removed from the yoke, can definitely come apart, and it can be really annoying to put back together again because there's a lot of little needle bearings in there. So I'm going to try to keep track of which strap is which and which bolt is which and put them back together exactly the way they came apart. What's really essential is that the small tab on the yoke does not get broken off in the process. So there's one strap. I'm just going to put its bolts together with it and set it aside. Then I can turn the entire thing over and get to the other side. Alright, now both straps are off. Once the straps are both out of the way, and they turn it to the side, I want to put the pry bar behind the U-joint and push against the yoke and break it forward. Do a really good job. Maybe both caps will come with it. In this instance, one cap has come off. If the cap comes off like this, just remember it's full of little tiny needle bearings, and we don't want any of them to move as we place the cap back onto the U-joint. Now to keep it from coming off, I'm going to turn it in such a way that gravity's helping me. And I'm going to take a little bit of masking tape and go around the whole thing a couple times so that when I have it off the vehicle, it won't go anywhere. So we're going to just go around it a couple times, just enough to hold those U-joint caps in place. So you have them in place. Remove the differential from the transfer case. Let's make sure we can see what we're doing over here. Now there's the slip yoke, and all you need to do is gently pull back on the entire propeller shaft until it comes free from the differential. And just Let's go ahead and set that aside. It's a really good idea to grease the part that just came out of the transfer case, especially on the inside, but on the outside as well, whenever we go to reassemble it, because if we don't do that, we can end up with some issues. Mostly this sort of squeak that happens when you go to take off. So here we are at the front differential yoke where it connects to the transfer case drive shaft or propeller shaft, and we're using an 8mm socket wrench again. Got a slightly bigger wrench this time. Alright, there's one side off. If you truly cannot break it free, you may want to put the vehicle back into gear. I'm having some trouble getting it to move, so I'm going to go try putting it back into gear. With it in gear, there should be some resistance in the drivetrain, and that should help you break these bolts if there's an issue. Alright, with the front telescoping drive shaft, I actually do not want to pull it out of the yoke right away. I want to leave it connected to the yoke while we move to the other end of the drive shaft, which is here at this double cardian joint that goes to the front drive shaft yoke. So you can see there's one U-joint that's attached to the back of the drive shaft, and then another U-joint that connects it to the yoke. And we're going to take out these 4 bolts right here. These 4 bolts are going to be 12 point. It's still an 8mm socket, 12 point, and you're going to need a wrench that lets you get in there. Sometimes it can be pretty difficult to find the right combination of things. First 2 are pretty easy, and then after you get the whole thing started, you may need to hold it while you move them. And in this case, I'm not getting the wrench all the way on there. But once you get them started, they should come out fairly easily. Now technically the dealer service manual does say to remove and replace these bolts on the drive shaft each time due to a small amount of stretching that can occur. If you run out of room, you may need to get a 12-point wrench. I went and grabbed a small 8mm ratcheting wrench that happens to be 12-point on the back. And if you're not getting enough clearance in the spot you're working in, go ahead and rotate it. As long as it's back in neutral, you should be able to get it to move where you want it to. And now we can flip the whole thing over and get to our other 2 bolts. If you can't get it started, go ahead and put the vehicle back into gear. Hey, baby. Alright, so I have re-engaged the transfer case and I put it in park so that I can get these two started. A longer lever might always be easier. There's that one. That's not quite the right angle. There's that one. Okay, and as we remove this last bolt, we want to pay attention. We may even want to get a second hand on the drive shaft. We'll see how it goes. Usually the telescoping end will stay in place. Sometimes, depending on the angle, as soon as this bolts out, the back end of the drive shaft may fall out of position. Now you can see that the U-joint is sealed, so we don't have to worry about the caps falling off this side. Okay, I've got the bolts out, but we do need to worry about the caps falling off the other side. To the front yoke, the front part of the differential. And we're going to keep a hand on the drive shaft while we put a pry bar into the yoke behind the U-joint. And again, once we have the U-joint free, we want to be careful not to knock these two caps off. I'm putting a little bit of pressure on the entire drive shaft right now to hold it up against the transfer case. And now it just popped down a little bit. And again, I'm going to take some masking tape. You could use just about anything. And just go around these caps a couple times so that they don't get lost. Alright, so now the entire assembly is going to come forward away from the transfer case and be set gently on the ground or on your shop bench. Now's a good time to get at that Zurich on there and give it a little greasing if it hasn't had any lately. Okay, so the two drive shafts have been removed from the transfer case. And we're going to again go put it into neutral. So now we have both drive shafts removed, and we're going to take a look at separating this piece of linkage right here. This linkage connects the shifter inside. Just want to get behind it with a pry bar and be careful not to damage this little green plastic insert. It's between the two of them. It still does take a little bit of force. You want to just pop this piece of the linkage off. Go ahead and set it to side. And you don't really need to disconnect any of the other linkage. And then up here, you can see there's a small tube. And that tube is the breather for the differential. And we want to just remove this tube. There may be a metal connector on the end of it, or it may just be free. Either way, just put some pressure up on it and gently move it. We definitely want to put this somewhere that we don't lose track of it. I'm going to stick it on the main linkage for the other shifter right there. Okay. So now coming up in here, on the top is our four-wheel drive switch. We're going to unplug the four-wheel drive switch. And then coming around to the other side of the transfer case, let me just move a couple things here. On the other side, we can see our speedometer connection. So there's the Speedo connection up there. And we just want to unplug that also. And be careful not to break the little plastic tab off of it, or it may have difficulty holding in place. So this piece of wiring and the other piece of wiring can be moved out of the way toward the front of the transfer case. And remember, there's a little clip on the very top that holds them both in place. So to set up our transmission jack, we're going to go ahead and get the transmission jack underneath the vehicle. And we're going to start adjusting some of the angles until we get close to where we want it to be. So I found that I usually have to change the shape of the transmission jack quite a bit to be able to get it to line up. So I'm going to loosen up the bolts on my transmission jack arms using an adjustable wrench so they all move freely. Then I'm going to think about how to get my transfer case past the piece of exhaust and the catalytic converter, which are right next to it on one side. It's pretty essential to use some kind of strap in this situation, because the transfer case angle is going to be much higher on one side than it is on the other side as you flip these little tabs around. And what you really want to do is find a way that it can sit solidly on the jack and be connected by the strap. So once you have the jack stand in a position that looks like it will both clear the catalytic converter and hang on to the bottom of the transfer case really well, you just want to go ahead and bring it down lightly and attempt to tighten the four arms exactly where you had it so that it won't go anywhere. Alright, so I have tightened all four of the arms on the transmission jack. And I've got it positioned in such a way that it's hanging on to this bottom edge right here. Now I'm going to take a strap, and it could be a chain, either one, connect it over the top of the transfer case. So we're going diagonal from one side over toward the other side. And usually I end up going in between the two parts of the case that you would use to pull it apart on one side, and then in front of the yoke on the other side. Okay, so I've got the transmission jack aligned with the bottom of the transfer case. Hey, baby. And I've got all of the arms on it tightened up in such a way that it can't go anywhere. Now I'm taking a strap and placing it over the top of the transmission, over the top of the transfer case. And just be careful not to catch any important parts above the transfer case in your strap. There's a couple of brake lines, in my case, that go by there. I'm actually ending up on the outside of the yoke. Take up as much slack as you can before starting to tighten your strap. So we want to end up in a situation where both sides of the strap are tight. Strap goes up one side of the transfer case and then goes over the top of it without catching any wires or any brake lines, and then comes down to the transmission jack again. So the transfer case should be able to stay on the transmission jack even once we take the bolts out. Okay, so now we're going to start working on these 9/16 bolts that hold the transfer case to the transmission. So these are the bolts, or these are the nuts that hold the transfer case onto the transmission, and there are 6 of them. I'm going to start with the very top one because it's a little harder to get. It's got a metal plate on the top of it, and you have to get behind that metal plate. So I'm going to get a little stubby version of my ratcheting socket, make sure I'm on reverse, and then I'm going to reach up from the passenger side to get behind the plate that sticks up and is attached to that same nut up there. And once I have it in the right place, I'm going to take that top nut off of the transfer case first. There's really not a lot of room in there, and there are several sharp screws that come down from the body of the vehicle nearby that you need to be careful about, because those sharp screws will definitely injure your hand. But it's not incredibly tight. You should be able to move it with the stubby version of the wrench. We're just going to gradually get this nut off of the stud that holds it in place. And take off the piece of metal that comes with it. So this is what the piece of metal looks like. And in my mind, while this could probably hold a connector for the brake lines, it also is something that if the transfer case were to make contact with the bottom of the vehicle, hits first. So it's held on there with the first 9/16 nut. And when we get that off, we're just going to set it aside. And we're going to continue working on the other 9/16 nuts all the way around it. So the next one down, in this instance, is right here. And if you can't break it loose with the stubby, go ahead and get a full-size wrench on it. And back that nut off. And once you get enough turns off of it, it may just be finger tight. This one near the exhaust can sometimes be difficult to get without an extension. I'm going to go grab an extension to make my life easier. So now I'm over on the passenger side here, and you can see the last nut is right there above this part of the overdrive case. And I'm just going to use the extension to give myself the clearance I need on the passenger side here to get past my catalytic converter and still be able to turn this nut. And once you break it free with the larger wrench, this might be another instance that the small stubby socket wrench is just easier to get in there and work with. Okay, I'm going to double check and make sure that that's all 6 of them. Just by reaching around and feeling the flange of the overdrive unit. Yeah, that's all 6 of them. Okay, so now that we have all of the bolts that hold the transfer case to the overdrive removed, we're going to lift up just slightly on the transmission jack. We really don't want to go very far, just a little bit till it's snug. And we're going to start pushing everything toward the rear of the vehicle. You need to find the right amount of lift, but really not very much lift. Sometimes it may help to get in there with a screwdriver between the transmission housing on the back here and the transfer case. So I'm going to go grab a thin standard screwdriver. Because this Jeep is a 94, it has the longer input spline, or input shaft. If you have a later model, like a 97 or so, it may not take as much movement to get the transfer case to come away. So as soon as you pull the transfer case far enough away from the transmission overdrive housing, you're going to start to get some fluid leakage. So you need something underneath there to catch the transmission fluid that's going to start coming out of the back of the transmission. Okay, so once you have something catching the fluid, you still want to continue to just push back on the transfer case until you get enough distance that the input spline can come off of its connection to the rear of the transmission. Some instances you may have to tilt it down a little bit as you come back. And I usually end up grabbing the rear retainer on the transfer case and wiggling it around some, attempting to get it to come off of its connection to the transmission. Sometimes you can come down slightly on the jack, or you can come up slightly on the jack, and then keep wiggling backwards. In my case, I have something that I've put in my way that's modified the Jeep. So I'm going to actually have to remove the Speedo gear. Okay, so hopefully as long as your Speedo gear hasn't gotten in the way of anything, you should be able to bring the transfer case back enough that it starts to tilt away from the main gear. Once you can see that it's tilting away, you can be pretty certain that you're off of it. You want to grab the whole transfer case and push back on it, hopefully bringing the jack with it as a unit. And then just each time bring the jack down slightly as you keep pulling back on the entire transfer case and working it off of the back of the transmission. Once you hit it free, it should tilt. You should be able to see the gear in the back of the transmission. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Should be able to see that things are separated. Till you can see that gear, the input is still engaged onto the transmission. Okay, so now that I see that it's clear, I can ever so gently begin to come down on my transmission jack. And hopefully I'm not caught on anything. Keep an eye on the catalytic converter. It's most likely to get caught on the catalytic converter. Okay, so once the transmission jack is all the way down, still going to have a little bit of dripping, but we're going to start to pull this out from underneath the vehicle. Some instances you may need to take the floor jack and bring the rear of the vehicle up and in order to be able to clear the catalytic converter. Just depends on how high your lift is. In my case, can only get to about there. I could go out the driver's side, but because of my setup I'm going to have to go out the passenger side. So I need to get my jack and bring the entire rear of the vehicle up a little bit higher to get this out. Okay, so I have lifted up the back of the vehicle and the jack a little bit higher in order to be able to clear the exhaust. See, once it clears the exhaust, sometimes it tilts back a little bit farther. And in order to be able to clear my rock rail and get it out on this side. So that's our transfer case removal process. See, this is the spot over here where the Speedo gear was removed. Speedo gear was a 10mm bolt. Has a little catch that holds it in place. And it came out like this. There's the entire unit. Now I'm going to go get my other transfer case and we'll reinstall that one in the vehicle. So one note with the transfer case, as you break this strap, it may try to fall off the transmission jack. So you want to be ready with both hands to pick it up and then move it onto whatever you're going to use to move it where it's going. I've lifted the transfer case off of my transmission jack and I have it on a dolly here to go ahead and take it to where I'm going to store it. I'm going to go get the other one. I have both transfer cases out of the vehicle. I'm just going to double check and make sure that I have the same amount of input. So we are at 1/8 past 1.5 inches. Outside there, and we'll double check on our other transfer case. We are at 1/8 past 1.5 inches. Okay, so that's the correct sized input shaft.